Hi, thanks for coming to this online conference from your own homes. My name's Holly Engstrom. I'm going to be giving a talk on how group gender affects leadership for this online AOM. So, many of you have probably seen the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, or at least you've heard of this famous scene in it, where Alec Baldwin's character kind of rips into his real estate agent employees. So he tells them, if you don't meet your quotas, you can't have any coffee. Oh, and by the way, the person who sells the least this month is fired. So one way we can describe his method is to say that he's a dominant leader. And a dominant leader is someone who leads by threat and intimidation to gain influence over others by instilling fear in them. So they prioritize their own power above everything else. And we can see that dominance when Baldwin's character makes sure to show the agents who's boss by threatening to fire them all. Aside from dominant, we could also say that Alec Baldwin is a man. And maybe him being a man is part of what explains his dominant approach to leadership. And this idea has garnered a lot of interest. These citations are just the meta-analyses that had looked at the gender differences in leadership style. So not the original papers, the meta-analyses. And some of these find that men do lead more forcefully and aggressively than women, but there's lots of other unrelated findings in here as well. My point is just that we actually know quite a lot about how a person's own gender shapes their leadership. But it's not just Alec Baldwin who's a man in this scene. The group of employees he's yelling at are also all male, and this is something that we know a lot less about. We've only been able to find a few papers looking at group gender and leadership at all, and really these papers are all looking at how men versus women respond to female versus male leaders. And the question that we want to ask here is, how much does a group gender influence how much dominance their leaders use? So really our question is, if Alec Baldwin had walked into a more modern real estate agency, which in 2020 is much more likely to be staffed by women than men, might he have done so with a whole different, much less dominant attitude? In fact, that's exactly what we predict. So we think people will choose to lead men in a more dominant way. But why? So why do we think Alec Baldwin might have behaved differently trying to lead a group of women compared to men? Well, when you see a group of men, you're likely to stereotype them as agentic. So high-performing, competitive, assertive. And this might make you worry that the group is going to try to take over, that they're not going to listen to you, they're not going to respect your authority. And in other words, that might elicit in you a goal to hold on to your power, to flex your authority and show that you're in control by directing people what to do. So in short, to adopt a more dominant leadership style. In contrast, when you see a group of women, you're likely to stereotype them as communal, friendly, caring, and trustworthy. Right? These are nice people. They're not going to try to take over your position, and actually, what you probably want is to make sure they get along and that they like you. So that might make you kind of abandon these more forceful strategies and instead take a much less dominant approach. So in our first study testing this idea, we just asked people to imagine leading a hypothetical group. And every study I'll present today is pre-registered on the OSF. So in this study, we had M-Turkers imagine that they were the leader of a group project for work or for school, and we manipulated within subjects the gender of the group. So each participant saw one single gender group, told us how they would lead that group, and then they did the same thing for a second group of the opposite gender. So we selected the faces randomly for each participant. So one person might have seen these two groups, another might have seen these two groups, another might have seen these two groups. Okay, you get the idea. So then we asked participants to tell us how they would lead the group. And we asked them about dominance. So basically, how much like Alec Baldwin in that scene are you, using a scale with items like these. So for example, I'd enjoy having control over others in this group. And sure enough, what we find is that people say they would lead in a more dominant way when they're leading groups of men, which is this blue bar on the left, compared to groups of women, so this red bar on the right. And we also look to see whether this differed based on participant gender, and it doesn't. So this interaction is not significant, meaning that both men and women are showing this pattern where they're saying that they would behave more dominantly when leading men compared to women. Okay, so in this first study, we found evidence that people do want to lead groups of men in a more dominant way than groups of women. But of course, this study is just people imagining how they would lead a hypothetical group. So we don't know what that would generalize to the real world. So in our next study, we wanted to find real leaders of gender segregated groups. And so to do so, we found coaches of kids' sports teams, because youth sports are pretty much always segregated by gender. So I spent the last year running around hockey arenas and soccer fields to convince hundreds of coaches to tell us how do they act with their team. So do they bark orders to the kids like a dominant leader, or do they just roll over and let the kids do whatever they want? So all of these coaches, we asked them to think about their team and how they coached it using similar items from the adapted dominance scale. So for example, I use forceful tactics to get my way with the kids on my team. And we also assessed a bunch of potential covariates that we thought might be important. But to avoid the potential for experimental degrees of freedom, we pre-registered that we'd first look at which of these variables actually were important, so which ones even are correlated with dominance at all. And then we would use just those in our actual analyses. And as it turns out, only one of this whole list of variables is even related to dominance, which is that coaches with more training tended to be more dominant. And here's the results. So replicating what we found from our hypothetical online study, coaches of boys' teams acted more dominantly than coaches of girls' teams, and this was true with or without covariates. And in fact, it doesn't matter what combination of covariates we try from the list on the previous slide, even if we add them all in, this effect of group gender is still there. So the other thing to remember is that these are all male coaches, so we can't test for any interactions with participant gender here. Okay, so in study 2, we had real coaches talk about their real behavior, but again, this is self-reported real behavior, not actual behavior. So we still want to know, what do people actually do when leading groups of different genders? To address that, in study 3, we looked at lab-based leadership among university students. So in this study, first we gave participants a bogus leadership test, which is actually a leadership IAT. And then we told them we're calculating their score, they wait a while, and then eventually they see that they got a really high score on this test. And then the experimenter came in and told them that they got the highest score in the group and they're going to be the leader for today's task. So the next part of the study is that participants record a baseline video introducing themselves to their group. So I'll just show you some snippets of some things that a couple participants said in these baseline videos.
Sorry, I had to remove this for the version that will be publicly posted on YouTube.
Okay, so at this point, these guys don't know anything about their group. They just know that they're the leader. So we get them to record this baseline video so that later we can see how each participant has shifted from their own baseline once they learn the gender of the group. So then we give them a bit of information about the task they'll be doing. So we tell them that the group's task is going to be to design a training program for campus tour guides, because right now the tour guides are terrible, they're constantly getting lost and so on. And we also tell them there's going to be a $100 prize for the best performing groups, and the leader can decide how to share that prize among the group members. So now comes the manipulation. Early on in the experiment, when participants had arrived in the waiting room, the experimenter took their picture. And at this point, participants see their picture come up on the screen under the word leader, and then they see pictures of their group members come up below. And depending on their condition, they'll see 3 male undergrads or 3 female undergrads as the group they're going to be leading. And as in the first study, this is just an example of the photos participants might see. We had lots of different male and female photos that we used for these groups and selected from randomly for each participant. And then finally, to get our key DV, we had them record a second video. And at this point, they're supposed to tell the group about the task. So now we can see, now that they know the gender of the group, are they going to change their level of dominance? So for example, this guy on the left starts out his video by saying this. Okay, so you can probably tell based on these two videos alone which one of them was leading men and which one was leading women. But of course we need to do some coding of the videos to test this empirically. So we had research assistants, we gave them a ton of training on this, so they coded all the videos for dominance, and while they were doing so, they're totally blind to hypotheses and condition. And just to give you a sense, this guy on the left, on a scale from 1 to 5, was pretty low dominance, both at baseline and in the main video. Whereas the guy on the right, his dominance shot up from the baseline to the main video. And as you might expect based on this, the guy on the right was leading a group of men, the guy on the left leading a group of women. And that pattern emerges across the sample as well. So we see this robust effect, even though now we're using real behavior and recorded videos, we still find that participants become more dominant when they think they're going to be leading a group of men compared to a group of women. Okay, so what? So people lead men more dominantly than women. What does this mean? Well, that's what we're working on right now. And the key here is what kind of leadership is actually good for people. So do men actually thrive under highly dominant leaders, whereas women thrive more under leaders who are less dominant? If so, then great, right? This is an adaptive kind of sensitivity to the group you're leading and the context. But if not, then leaders aren't helping their groups reach their full potential. So to start testing this, in this study, we took the videos from the previous study and we showed them to 819 student participants. And each participant saw a randomly selected set of 4 videos, so they'd see a range of dominance. And we were interested in seeing whether women and men would differ in what kind of leadership strategies they preferred. So for each of the 4 videos participants saw, they rated the leader on the same 6 items to measure how effective they thought this leader would be at leading them. And we created these items in pilot testing. They include items like how much would you like to have this person as your leader, how effective would they be, how much would they help you get along with people, and so on. And then what we want to test is, do men and women differ in how they rate leaders depending on how dominant those leaders are? So in the previous studies, we were looking at how leaders responded to group gender, but here we're looking at how potential followers or group members who differ themselves in gender respond to leaders, so the participants of the previous study who recorded the videos. So what I'll show you here is our followers' ratings of these leaders and how those ratings differ as a function of the leader's dominance as rated by our coders, so that's going to be along this horizontal axis. And what we're interested in is whether this pattern differs depending on followers' gender. And we find that it does. So as the leaders get more dominant, or further over to the right, you can see that men's ratings, the blue line here, they get more positive, whereas women's ratings, the red line, get more negative. And this matches what people in our previous studies were doing, right? So when they're leading women, they shift their leadership style over here to the left, which looks like it makes sense, since women seem to dislike these really dominant leaders on the right. And then when they're leading men, they're shifting their leadership style more over to the right, which also looks like it makes sense because that's where men are giving the highest ratings. So our leaders' intuitions for how to change their leadership strategy seem to be suited to our group members' actual preferences. And of course, this data is all self-report, so we don't know if it actually affects how the group performs or how effective the leader is, but this at least suggests that leaders' intuitions might be a good fit with followers' preferences. So in sum, based on the results that we've seen, it makes sense that when Alec Baldwin was talking to this group of men he wanted to lead, he sort of stepped into that forcefully. He threatened them, he told them exactly what they needed to do. And if he'd instead stepped into a room full of women, he probably would have done so in a less dominant and more cooperative way. And just as an aside, last year there was supposed to be an all-female revival of Glengarry Glen Ross on Broadway, but it was canceled. And previous research might suggest it didn't work, like it wasn't plausible, because it just didn't make sense that a female leader would act in this tough, dominant way. But the research that I just presented suggests that maybe this actually failed because it didn't make sense that anyone would act in this tough, dominant way when leading a group of women. Maybe it's just not plausible that that dominant leadership strategy would be used in this situation. So thank you all so much for listening. Thanks to my co-authors, my lab for a ton of great feedback, and all the research assistants who made this research possible. Bye.